Hello, welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse. And before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course my underwater train finders. You are the reason why this content remains gone. Just gone. They're gone, you guys. And today, we're going to talk about locomotives that are just that. Not necessarily extinct. I mean, a few of these are. But these are locomotives that survived well past the steam age, but still wound up scrapped. They were almost preserved. At least a few of them actually kind of were preserved in a way, but not in any real safe place. I didn't want to make this list a part of the preserved but scrapped anyway series, because some of these weren't actually in preservation. They were in scrap yards, but survived a really, really long time, even in that situation, and were almost preserved. And a handful were kinda sort of preserved in a way, but not in the way that would be beneficial, like in a museum. Let's just go. Let's just go. These are 5 locomotives that almost survived, but didn't. Jones Laughlin Steel, number 59. Now, this is a weird one, and I'm putting low on the list because, in a way, she kinda survived, just not intact. Number 59 was a 23-inch gauge 040T. She was a tank engine that was built by the H.K. Porter Company in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in April of 1941 for use at the J&L South Works. 59 was actually one of 7 sister locomotives, 57 through 63, that were built between 1937 and 1945, and are actually the heaviest by axle load 2-foot gauge locomotives that were built for American railroads. Looking at this picture, you can probably see they were a bit weird. They, were very, very, very square. And that's just the shape of the tank around the boiler, to be honest. But, yeah, they were very industrial looking, very much kind of like how diesels were going in that direction, but they were steam locomotives. And they were pretty powerful. They put their weight to good use, with over 16,000 pounds of tractive effort. Of the 7 built, 4 still do exist. 6 of them were purchased by Crown Metal Products in the 1970s, and they were moved to Roanoke, PA, and offered for sale. 1 of them was scrapped. 2 were sold to Canada, 1 went to Colorado, and 2 more went to Bencart Rigging in Cranberry, PA. Cranberry is actually where 59, as well as her sister 58, wound up. In 2014, 58 actually wound up purchased by the Youngstown Steel Heritage and moved to Youngstown on December 30th, 2014. That locomotive actually returned to operation in 2019 and is the primary attraction at the J&L Narrow Gauge Railway. So a happy end for her sister, but what about 59? Well, it was discovered back in the 90s that 59 had a sizable crack in her right cylinder casting. This prompted the owner of that time to cut her up to make room in the yard. 59 was disassembled and partially scrapped, but her boiler and a handful of her parts, including the side rods and valve gear, were saved. Only the frame, cab, and saddle tank were destroyed. The boiler went to Ohio, and then wound up being sold to the Niles Canyon Railway in California. When 58 was purchased, 59's boiler and remaining parts were actually brought to Youngstown, near where her sister's in operation. What's left of her is still there, being kept in reserve as a spare boiler. There is the consideration of just rebuilding 59, giving her the parts again that were taken away, but there's no updates on that idea. Plus, it would be violently expensive to do so. In my mind, it is likely that she is going to remain a set of spare parts for her sister. And when her sister's boiler goes, 59's boiler will be used on 58. But at least she's not completely gone, unlike everything else on this list. Norfolk and Western, numbers 2143 and 2174. This is a particularly sad story, as these locomotives were actually almost saved, but they just didn't quite get there. They were class Y6s, 2882 articulated compound steam locomotives. They were Mallets, and they were built in the Roanoke Shops. 2143 is actually the only one that was just a Y6 though. 2174 was a Y6B, but they were still both Y6s and naturally very, very similar. There was actually a second Y6B along with them, 2189, and there was an S1A Class 080 switcher with them. With them where, though? But when Norfolk and Western ended steam in 1960, all 4 of these locomotives were sold to the Virginia Scrap Iron and Metal of Roanoke, Virginia, a scrap yard, and that's where they were sitting together. 2143 lost her tender pretty quick by late 1960, and 2189 was also cut up early on, as well as the S1A switcher. So it was just 2143 and 2174 sitting there. And they sat in the scrapyard until the 70s. 16 years, in fact, they both sat around, likely sharing stories of the good old days when someone loved them. But in a weird way, someone did love them. See, the reason why they sat around so long was because the manager of the scrapyard at that time had a soft spot for steam locomotives, and didn't really want to see these big giants go to waste. He was hopeful that someday someone would be able to put forward the money to actually purchase one of them, at least. It was in the 70s that local rail fans finally realized that these 2 sisters were still there, in the scrapyard, and they started a fundraising effort to try to save both of them, which was supported by the owner of the scrapyard. However, he asked for $10,000. You may think he was asking too much, but to be fair, with the size of these locomotives, the scrap value may have been even more than that. And he couldn't just give them away, he needed to make some money for what he spent on them all those years ago. So I kinda get his position, and he was willing to let them sit there until the money could be worked up. But the problem was that he was getting old, and he passed away, and the ownership of the yard fell to a British organization, believe it or not. Excuse me, this better have nothing to do with you. Allegedly, the British were way less sympathetic to the steam locomotives, interestingly enough, and they said that they wanted both those locomotives gone in less than a month. It was basically impossible to raise that amount of money in that amount of time, and as a result, both 2143 and 2174 were cut up in 1976. Some parts of them were salvaged, but outside of that, this action rendered both the Y6 and the Y6B subclasses completely extinct. They were gone. Texas and Pacific number 638. This was a Class I 1B, which is a 210-4 Texas type, which is fitting for Texas and Pacific, I suppose. It was built in January of 1928 by Lima. She was designed to haul passenger and freight trains on the railroad, and did that for many years. However, when the railroad chose to dieselize, she was eventually donated to the city of Dallas, Texas, for the State Fair of Texas back in 1953. She remained in Fair Park as a park locomotive for a couple of years, and this is where the problem started. See, some people consider park locomotives preserved, and in a way they are, but they have to be maintained. And, 638 was neglected, horribly so. She was heavily vandalized, there was no covering, and she was quickly falling apart. It was so bad that the city didn't even want to fix her, they just decided to get rid of what they saw as an eyesore. She was sadly scrapped in February of 1955. But some good came out of her loss, actually. For one thing, if this sounds familiar, that's because this is the locomotive that New York Central 482 Mohawk number 3001 was brought in to replace. And eventually, she would actually survive. The city learned from their mistake with 638 and kept 3001 relatively safe. And she's now in preservation, safe away from the president of New York Central at that time.
Where is that blasted 3001, boys?
How do we calm him down? I don't know, give him some metal to cut or something.
The Mohawks must be sliced and diced like all the other steam engines.
Additionally, the local public was really mad that 638 had been scrapped. The city didn't realize how much they actually cared. Most people actually genuinely loved the locomotive, and the fact that she was unceremoniously destroyed didn't sit well with them. So as a result, in 1963, the Age of Steam exhibit opened, which was developed as the Age of Steam Museum, which is a place where a lot of other locomotives are now safe. So, despite 638 being gone, a lot of good resulted from her loss. Southern Pacific 282 Class Mark V 743. This is another park locomotive, and it's yet another case of one of these blasted park locomotives going very, very, very badly. This locomotive wound up in Girard Park in Lafayette, Louisiana, but much like 638, little was done to keep her, protected from vandalism and the elements, and she began to eventually succumb to weather and neglect. Eventually, in 1970, a park facility was supposed to be built where 743 was actually sitting, and instead of making any attempt to donate it to a museum or something, anything, it was just decided that she was in such bad condition, purely because of their own decision not to take care of her, she was scrapped instead, after only being there for 15 years. She lasted longer than 638, true, but it's still an incredibly sad story. Coos Bay Lumber 282T, number 10. This is a very alarming story because this is a locomotive that was scrapped in, let me check my notes here, 2011! Oh yes, this is that recent that we lost another steam locomotive. Built by Alco for logging service in Oregon in 1930, number 10 and her sisters were replaced by diesels in 1956. But Georgia Pacific was really famous for actually saving their retired steam logging locomotives. So number 10 was spared, and Georgia Pacific donated her to the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry in 1961, where she was then used as a fundraising auction prize. Not necessarily the best choice to use her for that, but okay. She was purchased at the auction for $1,800, which even in those days was actually kind of a steal if I'm being honest, by a man named Frank Bayless. Bayless worked on arrangement with the Oregon Pacific and Eastern in Cottage Grove, Oregon, for the display of number 10 at their engine house. A short section of track was then laid, and number 10 was put on static display there, until that railway ceased operations in the late 80s. After that happened, she was sold again to a group in Kansas, who intended to convert her to a 282 tender engine for operation on their short line in the Midwest. Interesting decision, but okay. But after number 10's cab, saddle tank, and oil bunker were removed, the project was abandoned entirely, and she sat derelict for a number of years. Then, in the late 90s, she was purchased again by a group in Florida, and then was shipped to Wilson Crossing RV Resort in Williston, Florida, which is not at all where you would have expected a steam locomotive to wind up, but that's where she remained nearly untouched until 2011. Her tank, cab, and oil bunkers had already been scrapped prior to the sale, so she was already missing a lot of parts to begin with. And the owner of the RV resort finally said in June of 2011 that if he couldn't find a buyer for the engine at that point, he would have to scrap her in order to remove her from the property. A number of rail groups actually attempted to try to obtain the engine, or at least parts of her, but the owner apparently thought the engine was worth way more than even her scrap value. He believed that she was worth $45,000 in incomplete condition. Sir, no. Absolutely not. That was twice her scrap value, by the way. The trucking cost for the engine back to the West Coast also exceeded $42,000 on their own. Because of this, it rendered purchasing the locomotive completely financially impractical. There was just no way to either do it at all, let alone justify that kind of expense. So on Monday, August 15th, 2011, Western Rail Groups contacted the owner of the property, and he told them that he had commenced scrapping of number 10, and she's now completely gone. But in one bright spot, I suppose, a sister engine of her, number 11, actually has been put in proper preservation at the Pacific Southwest Railway Museum at Campo, California. She's actually now the last sister standing, the only example of the original 4 Coos Bay Lumber Company Alco-built saddle tanks. And with that, a special thank you to all my underwater train finders. Some Dude 267, Orange Glass, Royal Hudson 2860, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitson 131-232, Mr. Black Rose, Josh Johnson, Metal for Life Guy, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, DM Tribal Typhoon, Tommy Rossini, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Joshua Long, Alaric Jaspers, Brian, Jack Carson's Railroad Videos, Major Klutz, Hayden DeGrow, Master of None, Dr. Razor 78, Crystal Morgan, and Ohio Trucker 1. Till next time, this is Darkness, to bid you all a fond farewell.